History is full of men who believed their rank made them untouchable. Field marshals who dismissed intelligence reports because no enemy would dare challenge their genius. Generals who sent thousands of men to die rather than admit a plan had failed. Admirals who watched their fleets burn because they could not fathom that they had been outthought. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, lasted 6 years and consumed over 70 million lives. And woven through its bloodiest chapters is a pattern that repeated itself again and again on every front. Men who held the highest ranks. Men who commanded armies and navies and entire theaters of war. Men who were certain, absolutely certain, that their position, their title, their prestige would see them through. They were wrong. Today, we are going to examine 5 extraordinary stories from the Second World War. 5 cases where rank, arrogance, and the refusal to adapt led to catastrophic, irreversible defeat. These are not stories of cowards. These were some of the most decorated, most experienced military minds of their generation. And that was precisely the problem. To understand why rank failed so many commanders in World War II, you first have to understand what rank meant in that era. Military hierarchies in the 1930s and 1940s were rigid, almost sacred institutions. A general who had risen through decades of service carried with him an aura of unquestionable authority. Subordinates did not challenge field marshals. Intelligence officers did not contradict admirals. Junior officers who raised concerns about operational plans risked their entire careers. This culture of deference, which had served traditional armies reasonably well in earlier conflicts, became a catastrophic liability when it collided with the unprecedented speed and complexity of modern industrialized warfare. In war, it is not rank or privilege, but only talent and service that matter. Said by Napoleon Bonaparte, a lesson his successors often forgot. World War II moved faster, hit harder, and demanded more adaptability than any conflict before it. Tanks broke through lines that were supposed to hold for weeks. Aircraft made entire naval doctrines obsolete overnight. Radio communications changed the speed of command. Logistics became as decisive as courage. The commanders who thrived in this war were the ones who could unlearn what they knew. The ones who failed, often catastrophically, were the ones who leaned on their rank as though it were armor. It was not. Our first story begins in May 1940, and it is perhaps the most dramatic military collapse in modern European history. General Maurice Gamelin was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in France. He was 70 years old, decorated from the First World War, and absolutely confident that he understood how wars were fought. He had spent years fortifying the Maginot Line, a vast, elaborate network of bunkers, artillery emplacements, and defensive fortifications stretching along France's eastern border with Germany. It was, by any measure, an engineering marvel. It was also completely irrelevant. On the 10th of May, 1940, Germany launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, its invasion of Western Europe. And here is where rank began to kill France. The German plan, conceived largely by General Erich von Manstein, was audacious to the point of lunacy. Instead of attacking through Belgium, where the Allies expected them, the Wehrmacht drove its panzer divisions through the Ardennes forest. The Ardennes, which the French High Command had declared impassable for armor. The Ardennes, which Gamelin had chosen to leave lightly defended. When reports began filtering in of German tank columns moving through those supposedly impassable forests, French intelligence officers were alarmed. Junior commanders at the front sent urgent messages. The information was there. But Maurice Gamelin, Supreme Commander, the most senior military figure in France, was operating from a headquarters at Vincennes that had no telephone, no radio, no direct communication with the front. His method of command had not fundamentally changed since 1918. Dispatch riders carried his orders by motorcycle. By the time information reached him and orders returned, hours had passed. In a war moving at panzer speed, those hours were fatal. Gamelin sat in his office like a man who believed the war would wait for him to think it through. Within 10 days of the German offensive, the Allied position had collapsed beyond recovery. The British Expeditionary Force was retreating to Dunkirk. France was falling. Gamelin was relieved of command on the 19th of May, 9 days after the invasion began. He had been replaced, but it was already too late. France fell in 6 weeks. An army of 5 million men, one of the most heavily fortified nations on Earth, was defeated in 46 days. Rank had told Gamelin he knew how wars worked. He did not know how this war worked. And by the time he understood the difference, France was gone. In September 1940, Italy held one of the most strategically valuable positions in the entire war. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani commanded an army of over 200,000 men in Libya, the Italian 10th Army, and faced a British force in Egypt that numbered barely 36,000 troops. The numbers were overwhelming. The strategic advantage was enormous. And Graziani knew it, which is precisely why what happened next is so remarkable. He did not move. Graziani was a decorated officer, famous for his brutal campaigns in Ethiopia and Libya during the 1930s. He held the rank of Marshal of Italy, the highest military rank his country could bestow. He was, by every official measure, one of Italy's greatest military minds. But Graziani was paralyzed by the reality of modern desert warfare. His army was magnificent on paper and deeply inadequate in practice. Supply lines were fragile. Equipment broke down in the heat. He wrote letter after letter to Mussolini explaining why he could not advance. He requested more tanks, more aircraft, more time. I am not in a position to undertake any offensive operation. My vehicle situation is critical. Marshal Graziani, August 1940. Mussolini, furious, pressed him forward anyway. In September, Graziani advanced 60 miles into Egypt, and then stopped. He ordered his men to build fortified camps and wait for supplies. The advance, such as it was, ground to a halt at Sidi Barani. What Graziani did not appreciate, what his rank perhaps blinded him to, was that the British were not sitting still. General Richard O'Connor, commanding a force a fraction the size of Graziani's army, was preparing something extraordinary. On the 9th of December, 1940, Operation Compass began. O'Connor launched a surprise attack with just 36,000 men against 200,000. Within 2 months, the British and Commonwealth forces had annihilated the Italian 10th Army. They captured over 130,000 prisoners, 400 tanks, and over 1,000 artillery pieces. Scale of defeat. In 10 weeks, O'Connor's force of 36,000 destroyed an army of 200,000 plus, advancing 500 miles and capturing 130,000 prisoners at a cost of fewer than 2,000 Allied casualties. Graziani fled. He would later write that he had faced an impossible situation, that the odds were against him, that he had been failed by his government and his equipment. He never quite grasped that the real problem was simpler than any of that. He had believed his rank, his reputation, and the sheer size of his force made him the dominant power in the desert. He had stopped moving, stopped thinking, stopped adapting. O'Connor, younger, lower-ranked, commanding a tiny force, had done none of those things. The desert did not care about rank. Of all the stories in this video, none is more complex or more tragic than the story of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and the Battle of Midway. Yamamoto was, by virtually every measure, the most gifted naval commander Japan possessed. He had studied at Harvard. He understood the United States better than almost any senior figure in the Japanese military. He had masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor, a plan so audacious, so carefully coordinated, that it shook the world. He held the rank of Fleet Admiral. He was a legend. And in June 1942, he walked into one of the most devastating ambushes in naval history. The plan for Midway seemed, on paper, overwhelming. Yamamoto assembled a fleet of over 200 ships, the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled. 8 carriers, 11 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. His objective was to seize Midway Atoll, lure out the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet, and destroy them. There was one problem, a problem that rank and confidence had obscured from Yamamoto's thinking. The Americans could read his mail. American codebreakers at Station HYPO, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, had cracked the Japanese naval code. They knew Yamamoto was coming. They knew roughly when. They knew his route. They even knew which atoll was the objective because they tricked the Japanese into transmitting it. Intelligence triumph. Commander Rockefort's team decoded enough of the Japanese plan that Admiral Nimitz could position 3 U.S. carriers in ambush, even though Japan believed the U.S. had only 2 operational carriers in the Pacific. But Yamamoto's plan had another fatal flaw, one that Rank had specifically created. His fleet was so large, so spread across such a vast stretch of ocean, that it could barely communicate with itself. He had divided his forces into multiple groups, each following a rigid timetable. Coordination depended on radio silence being maintained and every element executing perfectly. In war, nothing executes perfectly. On the 4th of June, 1942, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers at the most vulnerable moment possible, their decks loaded with armed and fueled aircraft preparing for a strike. In the space of approximately 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were mortally wounded. A 4th was sunk later that day. For carriers, 392 aircraft, and over 3,000 of Japan's most experienced naval aviators and crew gone. The major results of the Battle of Midway: Japan lost the offensive. The war was changed, said by Admiral Chester Nimitz after the battle. Yamamoto had planned a battle with 100 variables and assumed his rank and superiority of force would smooth them all out. He had not truly accounted for the possibility that his codes were broken. He had not accounted for American resilience following Pearl Harbor. He had not adapted his command structure to allow for the chaos of actual combat. He had built a plan that could only work if everything went perfectly. It did not. And the Pacific War turned on those 5 minutes above a burning flight deck. Yamamoto himself was killed the following year, shot down by American P-38 fighters who, once again, knew exactly where he would be. Because, once again, the codes were read. Rank and genius were not enough. Adaptability and intelligence, not the kind that hangs on your uniform, but the kind that reads the enemy and changes, decided the battle. By the winter of 1942, the German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful military formations in the world, had been fighting for Stalingrad for months. The city had become personal for Adolf Hitler. He had staked his prestige on its capture. It would not be abandoned. The Sixth Army would not retreat. The commander of the Sixth Army was General Friedrich Paulus, an immaculate staff officer, precise, loyal, deeply professional. He had planned Operation Barbarossa's logistics. He was exactly the kind of officer the Wehrmacht needed for complex operations. He was, by every measure, a man of great rank and great responsibility. He was also a man who could not say no. In November 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that swept around Stalingrad's flanks and encircled the entire Sixth Army. 300,000 German soldiers were suddenly cut off, trapped, surrounded by Soviet forces in a freezing Russian winter. Paulus's subordinate generals urged him immediately, break out. Use whatever fuel and ammunition remained. Fight through the Soviet encirclement before the ring closed fully. The window was brief, but it existed. Paulus refused, not because he thought it was the wrong decision. He refused because Hitler had ordered the Sixth Army to hold. And Friedrich Paulus, loyal, obedient, deeply respectful of the chain of command, would not act without permission from above. A general's first duty is to his men. His second duty is to his country. His duty to his commander comes after both. The breakout window closed. Hermann Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air. It could not. The daily supply requirement was over 500 tons. The Luftwaffe delivered, on good days, a fraction of that. Soldiers starved. Ammunition ran out. The temperature dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Still Paulus held. Still Hitler commanded him to hold. And still Paulus obeyed. On the 31st of January, 1943, Adolf Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, the highest military rank in the German armed forces. It was not a reward. It was a message. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler was betting that rank would keep Paulus in the rubble of Stalingrad until the last man died. The next day, Paulus surrendered. 91,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Of those, fewer than 6,000 ever returned home. Human cost. Of the 300,000 soldiers encircled at Stalingrad, over 160,000 died during the siege. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, fewer than 6,000 survived Soviet captivity to see Germany again. The tragedy of Friedrich Paulus is not a story of incompetence. It is a story of a man so conditioned by hierarchy, so shaped by rank and obedience, that when the moment came to exercise independent judgment, to save his men by defying an order that was sending them to their deaths, he could not do it. His rank had not protected him. His rank had been the cage. October 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle ever fought, before or since. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining naval strength in a final attempt to destroy the American invasion fleet in the Philippines. The Japanese plan, called Shogo, Operation Victory, was genuinely clever. A diversionary force would lure the main American carrier fleet northward. Then two strike forces would converge on the landing beaches through different straits and destroy the invasion transports. If it worked, it could cripple the American campaign in the Pacific. It almost worked, which makes what happened next all the more extraordinary. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the most powerful Japanese surface force, the Center Force, including the super battleship Yamato. He fought through the sea beyond sea under brutal air attack, losing one of his most powerful ships. He turned back. Then he turned around again. He pressed through San Bernardino Strait, the passage that should have been guarded by Admiral Halsey's main fleet. But Halsey had taken the bait. He had chased the Japanese decoy fleet northward, leaving the strait unguarded. When Kurita's massive force emerged on the other side, all that stood between him and the defenseless American invasion transports was a small group of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts, tiny ships, dramatically outgunned. It was, by any tactical measure, a massacre waiting to happen. Kurita's battleships and cruisers could have destroyed the American escort carriers within an hour and then fallen upon the invasion transports. The landings at Leyte could have been catastrophically disrupted. Then Kurita stopped, hesitated, and ultimately turned north, away from the transports, away from the decisive moment, into open ocean. The reasons remain debated by historians. His fleet was exhausted and damaged. Communications were confused. He believed, incorrectly, that he was facing a much stronger force. And there is this. Kurita was an admiral of the old school, shaped by a doctrine that prized destruction of enemy warships above all else. The unglamorous business of destroying transports, the killing blow against the invasion itself, did not fit the framework through which he understood naval warfare. He had the opportunity. He had the ships. And at the critical moment, the weight of his own doctrine, his own training, his own conception of what admirals do, stopped him. Paraphrased from post-war naval analysis, the American escort carriers and their escorts fought with extraordinary heroism, destroyers charging battleships in suicidal attacks to buy time, pilots flying ammunition-less planes at Japanese ships to distract them. They held. The invasion continued. Kurita had the rank, the ships, and the tactical opportunity. What he lacked, at the moment it mattered most, was the clarity to see the situation for what it was and act on it. The Japanese Navy never recovered from Leyte Gulf. The Philippines were lost, and with them, the oil that kept Japan's war machine running. 5 stories, 5 commanders, 5 catastrophes, and in each one, if you look carefully, you will find the same threads woven through the disaster. Gamelin trusted a plan built on the assumptions of a previous war. Graziani trusted the mathematics of numerical superiority over the reality of what was happening on the ground. Yamamoto trusted his codes, his plan, his overwhelming force, and did not leave room for the possibility that the enemy had already read the script. Paulus trusted obedience over judgment, hierarchy over the survival of his men. Kurita trusted his doctrine over his eyes. In every case, rank was not the cause of defeat, but rank was the lens through which these men saw the world. And that lens distorted everything it touched. Rank told them their plans were right, because men of their seniority did not make wrong plans. Rank told them they understood the battlefield, because men of their experience did not misread situations. Rank surrounded them with subordinates who were afraid to bring them bad news clearly and urgently. Rank made them slow when they needed to be fast, rigid when they needed to be flexible, certain when they needed to doubt. The commanders who won, Rommel adapting in real time across the desert, Zhukov relentlessly learning from every failure, Nimitz listening to his codebreakers and trusting what they told him. They wore their rank lightly. It was an administrative fact, not an identity. They led from the map, from the intelligence, from the actual situation on the ground. They stayed humble in the face of an enemy that would not cooperate with their assumptions. History does not judge by rank. The men who shaped the outcome of the Second World War, who determined which nations would survive and which would be broken, were not always the most senior commanders in the room. They were the ones who could look at a disaster unfolding and ask, honestly, without ego, without the protection of their own prestige, what is actually happening here? What do I need to change? What do I need to learn, right now, that I did not know yesterday? The tragedy of Gamelin, Graziani, Yamamoto, Paulus, Kurita, it is not that they were bad men. It is not even that they were incompetent. By the standards of their time, they were exceptional. They had earned their rank. They had proven themselves in previous conflicts. But warfare changed faster than they did. And the gap between who they had been and who this war needed them to be, that gap, invisible to them because rank had closed it over with certainty, cost millions of lives. They thought rank would save them. It didn't save them. It didn't save their men. And in some cases, it didn't save their nations. The lesson of the Second World War, repeated across every theater, every front, every campaign, is that the world rewards adaptability over authority. Reality does not negotiate with rank. It never has. If this video made you think differently about history, about leadership, about how the greatest armies in the world can fail not from lack of bravery, but from the weight of their own certainty, then drop a comment below. Which of these stories surprised you the most? Was it Gamelin's disconnected headquarters? Kurita's turn away from victory? Paulus receiving a field marshal's baton while his men starved? Let me know. Like the video if you want to see more deep dives into the human stories inside World War II. Subscribe. We publish every week, and there are stories in this conflict that most history channels have barely touched. I will see you in the next one.